Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. You know, it was recently revealed that Jamie Dimon rented out Buckingham Palace in order to entertain his close friend, Tony Blair. The dinner took place only days before Jamie Dimon had agreed to give the U.S. Department of Justice a very small cut of his ill-gotten mortgage fraud gains. And oh, how the penniless peasants outside Buckingham Palace gates rejoiced at the impossibly large number of $13 billion Jamie had paid. All hail Jamie Dimon! They cheered! But while the food stamp-needing, bedroom tax-paying, part-time working masses gasped in awe at the large sums of ill-gotten gains falling out of the financial tyrant's pockets, the likes of Jamie Dimon and his close friend, Tony Blair, know that winter is coming, and that when you play a Game of Thrones, you win or you die. Is that true, Stacy Herbert?
Apparently. Now, you know, everybody knows that we have this rising wealth and income gap and the inequality gap. The Gini coefficient index around the world is rising. But, you know, many people look at it and think that it's the poor that are going to rise up and that they're going to be angry with how little they have. In fact, over at Bloomberg.com, they're looking at it from another angle. Blame rich, overeducated elites as our society's fray. We have too many disgruntled elite wannabes. And because of that, this is what you're seeing, the social disintegration around the world. There are not enough positions of power with so many elite wannabes.
Yes, of course. Throughout history, this is the case, isn't it? Because there are only a certain number of top elites that can rule, and if that bulge bracket of elites gets too bulgy, gets too fat, gets too much of a goiter, not a goiter.
Gout.
A gout. No, hernia. It's like an elite hernia. It's like they're popping out of Congress and the Houses of Parliament. And they need to be lanced, they need to be boiled, they need to be excised, excommunicated. There needs to be an exorcism of the elites. But historically, when you have this hernia, this hemorrhoid of elites, like a Tony Blair is the hemorrhoid on the world, he just sits there on the rim of the detritus pouring out of his financial terrorism and picking up a little fee here and there in a busted walnut that's passing through. It turns into a revolution. This is historically what has always happened. Hemorrhoids like Tony Blair on the rim of the detritus of his ill-gotten gains, fostering revolution from the peasants who are tired of eating these digested walnuts. This is what happens.
Well, in fact, the article from Bloomberg.com calls this elite overproduction. It's called. You have too many elite wannabes, too many graduates from law school, too many graduates from Masters of Business Administration. You have too many graduates of medical schools. There are too many elites. And tied with that, historically, during times of revolution or civil war, increasing inequality leads not only to the growth of top fortunes, it also results in greater numbers of wealth holders. The 1% become the 2% or even more. There are many more millionaires, multi-millionaires, and billionaires today compared with 30 years ago as a proportion of the population, and hence unrest arises and an absence of cooperation happens as people start fighting for territories. And you saw this in the lead up to the Civil War, for example.
In America.
In America, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the point you're making here, which is interesting, one, is that in the wealth and income gap widens, that you'd expect the people being downtrodden to rise up and stage a revolution. But what we find throughout history is that it's the top elites who are not able to get themselves the best spot in Congress or the House of Commons or the Four Seasons in New York City or some hotel or restaurant or spa, that they're the instigators of the revolution. This is what starts the global insurrections, is when some miffed billionaire, like a Larry Ellison, who's a billionaire, if for some reason it was determined that the World Cup, the sailing competition, would not be conducted in the way he'd be happy with, I'm sure he would buy a nuclear weapon and bomb somebody, and World War III would be started. That's the way it all goes down.
Well, as the article points out there, millionaires and multi-millionaires and billionaires tend to be more politically active. You see it in the U.S. with all the Adelson on one side spending huge fortunes on getting policies that he wants. You have Soros on the other side.
Adelson.
Yes, Sheldon Adelson. And then on the other side, you have George Soros seeking his sort of policies. But underneath them, you have, in America, you have 25,000 surplus lawyers graduating every single year from universities. 25,000. Many people who go in for law degrees plan on becoming politicians at some point. So here they graduate with no jobs available and huge debts for the law schools in America. So they're anxious, they're angry, they're bitter. Now, I mentioned the Civil War in America that had a similar situation. Well, let's look back to that time. From 1830 to 1860, the number of New Yorkers and Bostonians with fortunes of at least $100,000, which would make them multimillionaires today, increased fivefold. Many of these new rich or their sons had political ambitions, but the government, especially the presidency, Senate, and Supreme Court, was dominated by the Southern elites. As many Northerners became frustrated and embittered, the Southerners also felt the pressure and became increasingly defensive. So there was an emerging sense of no longer were these elite cooperating, they started competing. They weren't willing to compromise. And you see that now, and it might not just be Southern versus Northern, though it kind of looks like that. It's about industries, perhaps big agricultural industries versus big military-industrial complex. There are too many people trying to get a cut of the pie.
Yeah, I mean, people don't understand this part of American history, that before the Civil War, Washington and the power in America was controlled by the southern states and their vast slave plantations that gave them their wealth, power, and influence. Then you had these upstarts, the Northerners in New England, New York, Boston, and they were frustrated because they couldn't get their way into the elite tables of Congress and the halls of power. And so this is what led to the Civil War more than anything else. So the rallying cry, "Free the Slaves," was a great banner headline that gave the North a great marketing gimmick, but mostly they were interested in pushing the Southern power core that occupied Washington out, and they could move in, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and many other nations and regions around the world, for example, had slavery or similar, like indentured servitude, and they managed to end it without war. But America was unable to because of this. There were too many elite. There was an overproduction of elite, too many elite. Now that takes me to the next headline here. The world's 2,170 billionaires control $33 trillion in net worth, double the US GDP. So not only have the world's richest been the biggest beneficiaries of the monetary and fiscal policies since 2009, with the current 2,170 global billionaires representing a 60% increase since 2009, according to UBS. That sounds like an overproduction of billionaire elites. But their consolidated net worth has more than doubled from $3.1 trillion in 2009 to $6.5 trillion now. At the same time, the net worth of the bottom 90% of the world's not-so-lucky population has declined. As you said at the top, winter is coming, and if you're going to play the Game of Thrones, there's only one throne, possibly 5, possibly 7, but that's it.
Game of Thrones? What about those White Walkers?
Exactly.
Those guys are scary.
Those are the zombie banks and the zombie banksters and the zombie people eating mud pies who don't mind eating a nice chubby little billionaire.
Well, let's give a good example of this. A concrete example would be the billionaires that rise up in Los Angeles through the movie industry, which is subsidized through a copyright cartel, and the influence and power in Washington to keep copyright extended every 20 years, the so-called Mickey Mouse Law. Now, these people want greater influence in Washington. They want greater lawmaking ability in Washington. So they use their lobbying efforts like the MPAA to change the entire industry of America, which would include Larry Ellison, which would Oracle, or include Google, or include AOL, by introducing digital rights management technology, or convincing the NSA that they need to spy on every single American, not only in wherever they are in the world, but Merkel, every leader in the world, the Germany's leader. That comes from the MPAA trying to dominate. As you point out, there's a kerfuffle in the halls of power, and here you have one group that's fueled by billions of dollars from a subsidy from the U.S. government and copyright law, given free money from Ben Bernanke at 0% interest rates, who are causing global consternation. If it weren't for Edward Snowden, we wouldn't even know any of this was going on.
But importantly, you mentioned, that's a good point to bring up, is Silicon Valley is near San Francisco. And this is a famous area for great universities, well-educated, overproduction of elites. So these ones are, you see over and over news stories emerging about how the locals are angry about the wealth of Silicon Valley and all the tech giants forcing them out. They're the ones that are bitter and angry because now they can't afford rent, whereas obviously Zuckerberg can afford to buy 6 houses, tear them all down just to have space between him and an ordinary person.
Right, and that's a direct relationship with the NSA, as we know. The Facebook is an NSA spy tool, and so is Google and these other outlets, and that is, as you describe it, a shuffle or a power struggle in Washington, where you've got these guys, multi-billionaires, struggling with each other, and as they rock and roll, trying to get there are only a certain number of seats you can have in Washington in Congress. Yeah. They don't expand them. Then the world suffers and they cause a global upheaval.
Well, there is not enough room for 2,170 billionaires. Those will have to be cut at least in half. So that's all we could tolerate. Now, what did solve the problem for the last situation similar to this in America was the Great Depression. It was the Great Compression. The wealthy lost a lot of wealth, and it was compressed down towards where the middle class is. And that brings me to this final chart, is the S&P 500. The Depression versus today. So the red line is the S&P up to for the Depression, and the blue line is today. As you see, the S&P 500 could still rise from 1800 up to 2000 by the looks of it, and then another big collapse. But we have had nowhere near the collapse that we had back in the Great Depression for the top, just for the bottom.
No, I think that's a good point, that the markets are certainly stretched, and they are stretched because of this incredible money printing that's gone on by the central banks and the financial engineering that has irrigated the economy in such a way as the free money goes into asset price appreciation but completely escapes wages. So nobody's had their wages increase on a real basis for 20 years. For 30 years, wages have been stagnant in the UK, in the US, in the West. But meanwhile, the money goes right into asset prices, and you've got an elite glut. An elite glut. There's a glut of elites.
That's why my final prediction, I say we're going to lose over 1,000 billionaires within the next 2 years. How we lose them, I don't know, but they will no longer be billionaires.
One can only speculate. Well, stay tuned for the second half, a whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to upstate New York and talk to James Howard Kunstler. He's the author of The Long Emergency, The Geography of Nowhere, Too Much Magic, and many others. James, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Nice to be here with you, Max.
All right, James, you say that America has, quote, failed to reckon the central quandary of our time, the fatal hypertrophy of finance, or is that hypertrophy? What is that word? What are you talking about? What is this all about, James?
Hypertrophy, I think, is the pronunciation. It really means just overgrowth, something becoming gigantic. And in our case, the financial sector of our economy went from being 5% of the total economy a few decades ago to being about 40% now. And the growth in the activity that represents is really a growth in the financial innovations that should be called swindles and frauds. These are two words that are rarely used in the discussion. And that's really sort of taken all the air out of the national room, shall we say.
Well, let's give an example of that here in the UK. There's a bank called the Royal Bank of Scotland. It's now 80% or so owned by the state. They were caught swindling a couple in Portsmouth out of their hotel by forcing them to not only take out a loan, but part of the loan was a credit default swap which they knew ahead of time would blow up in the couple's face. And then the couple lost their entire fortune. They lost their house. So RBS, the state-owned bank, committed an act of financial terrorism as part of the financialization you're talking about, correct?
Well, this sounds like an old 1920s bucket shop, as though it was run by the guys in the Home Alone movie.
Yeah, exactly. This is a bucket shop, and this is exactly what we saw in the 1920s, which of course led to the crash of '29. Is there a parallel, James?
Well, the thing that's interesting that you say is that this behavior was known to have taken place, and the misbehavior and misconduct that's taken place in American banking is well documented, well known, and probably the best well-known thing about it is that nobody's done anything about it. So there are no consequences for bad behavior in financial misbehavior.
Right now, the depression that resulted after the lead-up in the 1920s to the crash of '29 led to a compression in the wealth and income gap and set the stage for the American century, some might say. And also the Securities Act of '33 and '34, brought in by FDR, allowed for their architecture of finance to exist that would allow for some more equitable growth amongst those who are participating and benefiting from the securities industry. Is the only thing that's going to bring it back balance at this point a major crash, James?
Well, the distortions and impairments of capital formation are so bad now, and they've become so institutionalized that it's probably true that some kind of damaging event will have to occur to allow for the rebuilding of the institutions that regulate our money and regulate investment and financial transactions. Because, sooner or later, we'll just be at a point where people have no faith in paper and the assets that it's supposed to represent. So, yeah, it seems to me that we are cruising for a bruising, and that it will take really some kind of a radical and desperate shaking up for us to change our behavior.
All right, James Howard Kunstler, how would you describe your books? I know in the case of The Long Emergency, it's basically describing how the Earth's carrying capacity in terms of the environment is limited, and the population and our habits as modern humans is running up against the carrying capacity, and you're ending up in this incredible disconnect. But you also write on a number of topics. So just to give viewers an idea, how would you describe yourself?
Well, I would describe myself as a journalist, but what I've been following really is the arc of a story, and it's a story of an industrial civilization that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. One of the things that's missing from a liberal education these days is the idea that life is tragic. And by that, we don't mean that everything has an unhappy ending, but what we mean is that, stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the outcome depends on the choices that we make. And we've made some very unfortunate choices as a society. And we're failing to pay attention to what the consequences are. I think that the biggest part of the story at the moment is the delusional thinking. And a lot of it comes out of the psychology of previous investment. We've put so much of our national wealth into a certain way of life that we can't imagine changing it or letting go of it or altering our behavior to meet the new circumstances of what the future is telling us to do. And the future is telling us that we have to contract, we have to get more local, grow more food close to where we live. We're going to have to reckon with the dwindling of globalism. And these are all tremendous changes that we can't really afford to pay attention to. So we're not. We're just having a party instead.
Right. I guess that's what I was trying to get to, is that you're writing, it's very well researched, and you look very in detail at some of these ecological issues and on the issues of energy and energy consumption, but there's a philosophical bent to it when you describe a beginning, middle, and end. And now you are presenting a concept which you call, or are talking about the 2014 as the turning. So this is really a combination of a few things here. So talk to us about the turning and why it'll happen in 2014.
I happen to subscribe to the ideas that were articulated in the book The Fourth Turning by Strauss and Howe, that there are cycles of history and that we have entered one of those cycles that really takes about the length of human life, about 80 years. And that this is a period of tumultuous change. And what it really represents is the end of the industrial era as we've known it and the financial operations that have attended it. And the reason for that is that the cheap energy that fueled the last part of the industrial story is now coming to an end. And one thing that we're really unable to do now is run the interest operations of finance that were only made possible by the fact that we could continually inject new energy into this system. Now that that's no longer possible, we can't really repay the loans that we've taken out, and we can't create new loans because we have no prospect of paying them off. So the circulatory system of the economy, which is finance, is now getting blocked up, and we really don't know what we're going to do about it. All we're doing is pretending that we can create fictional money and keep on pumping it back into the system as though it was a Strasbourg goose. But the Strasbourg goose has Crohn's disease, and what's coming out the other end is this toxic sludge in the form of malinvestment that is really going to prevent us from carrying on as a civilization if we continue to behave this way.
So you point out that the financialization, which has been growing almost exponentially for decades, it's fueled in part with the energy industry and the credit needs of the energy industry, the global energy industry. These two have been progressing pari passu, to use a banking term, for decades. And of course, the idea of peak oil was quite popular recently, but less popular now because America is hugely now oil rich with their fracking and other oil exploration. They're soon to become the biggest oil entity in the world. Does that mean that the projections toward peak oil have to be changed, or am I missing something?
No, really, it's a result of wishful thinking. We want to believe that we have as much oil as we will ever need. A lot of this is focused on the shale oil in North Dakota and Texas. Last week, a market technical analyst named Ralph Ancampora actually said on the web that he expected us to become energy independent by 2016. You know, that it's an amazing statement because, of course, it would mean we'd have to find 8.5 million barrels a day of new oil to accomplish that, and the prospects of that are nil. Either that, or we'd have to give up driving cars altogether. So the wishful thinking is really behind this, but I think that the reality of the situation is that we've probably got about three more years of the shale oil boom, and then we're going to run out of the capital to keep on pumping into that because it's very expensive to run those operations. And then we're going to see the shale oil boom go up in a vapor, and we're going to be left with the ashes of our wishful thinking.
So you really have two tracks running through this post-World War II economy, credit and oil, and you've got the credit potentially hitting a moment of peak credit. That would be the moment when interest rates really start going higher, as opposed to this 30-year bull market in bonds where we've seen interest rates essentially trending lower. Janet Yellen, she's come in as the new Fed chairman. She has already stated more or less that she's going to keep the quantitative easing spigots flowing. They're going to go from $85 billion a month from quantitative easing probably to $150 billion a month. So there's your capital. There's your money for the oil exploration. So when is this going to end? Or it's being fueled with more cheap money. So is this really going to happen in 2014?
Well, what we're seeing now, of course, is the taper talk head fake 2. With the Federal Reserve pretending that it can end its purchase of bonds and U.S. Treasury paper. And of course it can't, because every time that it even whispers in its so-called forward guidance that they may neck down or taper their bond purchases, the 10-year Treasury note goes up, 10, 20 basis points. And that's actually been going on in the past week. My guess is that they may attempt a fake taper of maybe 10%, and they'll do it one time, and they'll pretend that they're tapering, and then the markets will have a whack attack, and the interest rates will freak out and start going up a lot, and then they'll go back to the full-on quantitative easing, or maybe even more, maybe even pushing it up to 100 billion a month. And it'll be perfectly clear that this part of the economy cannot exist without quantitative easing. And that's when people are really going to start losing faith in money. It's really only a question of which way we go broke, whether we go broke through hyperinflation or massive contraction and deflation. And either way, you're broke. In the first case, you have a lot of money, but it's worthless. In the second case, nobody has any money. So it just remains to be seen, what happens when we get to that fork in the road.
All right, fair enough. James Howard Kunstler, we're out of time. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
You're welcome, Max. Thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, James Howard Kunstler. You can learn more about him at kunstler.com. If you'd like to get in touch with us, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.